Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me today, as always, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir. And I'm gonna put my phone on silent.
That's a good
I don't know
call.
if you caught that right there.
No, mine is on the vibrate, so that noise will come occasionally, but oh well. Evan, you are in a different location because despite the fact that people are probably getting this episode, I don't know, somewhere near the middle of summer at this point,
Yeah. Or it could be
it is
the
still
next
Christmas time. Yeah,
It could be the next Christmas. You
could
never
be.
know. Maybe we're gonna
Yeah,
time this out perfectly. But
could be. But
yeah.
yeah,
So we've got a tree back here,
nice.
which we decided to put a little hat on for those who are watching us.
Nice. Is that your main Christmas tree, or your
That's
main
not
Christmas tree is in your normal spot?
our main Christmas tree is out in the living room. However,
Nice.
we didn't have a star either, so it also does have a little top hat on it.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's what we're
Okay.
using as the
Yeah,
Christmas tree topper this year.
so we've moved here to a new place, as listeners know. The background's changed,
Yeah.
sort of, slightly. But
Books are rearranged. That's
yeah,
really about it.
there you go. Yeah, so we have a higher ceiling downstairs, and since we just got a new puppy, we were going to go with the. By the way, I find it funny that we're going this deep into Christmas tree decisions and what is likely June for people.
I think it's a good thing. It's like when you're watching a sitcom on Netflix and they go into the Christmas
they go
episode.
to the Christmas episode. Yeah. So we have taller ceilings downstairs, and we wanted to go with an artificial tree just because with a new puppy here, I didn't want them eating the needles and branches.
Yeah.
Our previous puppies we'd had them for almost a year by the time Christmas came around. So we've done live trees most of the time, but we decided to go artificial. We thought a 9-foot one would work. We were aiming more for like 8.5, but all they had in stock was a 9-foot in the kind that we liked.
Oh, this sounds like an elf moment.
Well, no, that we went with the 9-foot and it fits. Apparently we have 9-foot ceilings is what I learned because it is right there. So there is no tree topper. We have the top of the tree is naked because it is right there at the ceiling. No room for a star. We'd have to put the world's smallest star up there. But yeah. So it's nothing on top. That hat that you have on yours wouldn't fit on the top of ours.
It wouldn't even make it. Oh, man.
Make it.
You could clip it on sideways. You could maybe do something.
Yeah,
like
maybe.
That. There we go.
Maybe that's about it.
Bit.
Yeah. So that's what we got for a tree setup here. But so for the next few episodes, Evan will have a different background because for those unfamiliar, we batch record these, and one day we'll start putting them out more consistently. So. All right, we are talking today about Genesis 2 verses 10 through 14, which I think sets a record for most verses we've covered in one episode for sure. Yeah. I think by a long shot, actually.
I think so too. But to be honest, I think most people, if they were doing this same project, wouldn't even have an episode dedicated to these verses. So I think we're still running a strange route.
Yeah, that's probably true. And we'll actually get into that point here, actually. So, all right, let's read it real quick. Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole hand of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium, I guess I'm going to pronounce that, and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. At a glance, and this ties into what you're talking about, where most people probably wouldn't dedicate an episode to these verses. This appears to be meant to describe a location. Mm-hmm. All right. However, and if we're going to take it as material truth, that's what we would look at it as, right? Mm-hmm. However, there are a couple of problems with that. All right. And the first would be that 2 of the rivers here are for sure familiar to us, right? The Tigris and Euphrates, those are well known. Mm-hmm. The problem is there appears to be no geologic evidence that at any point did they ever share a source, which this verse describes, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean for sure they never shared a source, right? It may be undiscovered, or we don't understand geologic patterns as we think we do. So that's possible. But for now, the chances of that seem unlikely. Then if we look at the other two rivers, there's a fair bit of debate around the identity of these rivers. All right. So if we look at the first one, the Gihon, there seems to be two possibilities that rise up more so than other things. The first is that the Gihon is the name of the principal spring that waters Jerusalem. So there's familiarity there. However, Cush is often used to refer to the land of Ethiopia and Egypt. And so the Nile River, it also seems like a likely possibility. Now, we don't know for sure, like we know the Tigris and Euphrates, but I would say that more consensus seems to lead towards the Nile River, right? Then we get to the fourth river here, or the first one as it's described to us. There seems to be no consensus regarding what exactly the Pishon is and what exactly the land of Havilah is. Really? There is all kinds of conjecture on what that might be.
Interesting. So and it's weird to have the Nile. I mean, aside from them being, the Nile is in the ancient Near East, but aside from that, it's very weird to have that somehow being argued as having the same source as the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Right.
I mean, they're definitely distant.
Yeah, that would be very odd for them to share a source. So rather than sort of just dismissing this passage as referring to some location that's lost, right, and not really consider the significance of it, which I think is what's often done. We often kind of brush over these few verses. I think we might want to consider why God would have inspired the inclusion of this kind of a passage in the Bible. For it to be there, I am operating under the assumption that it must have something of value and in some way be explanatory to us.
Yeah.
And in as much a symbolic way, right, if not a materialistic way, which is the approach we've been taking all along, right? That we're treating it as though the historicity of it is irrelevant. Maybe it's true historically, maybe it's not. If it is true historically, it still means something deeper than mere fact of what happened, right?
Well, and the thing is that these stories are so compact, and especially early in the Bible, like as soon, almost until you get to Abraham, and then Abraham, it feels like the stories get stretched out a little more. But these ones are so jam-packed with information in such short stories that it doesn't feel a lot of times like there's extemporaneous details.
Yeah, filler.
It's like, why would they fill in this detail, but not a lot of other potential details that they could put in?
Right.
And so for some reason, this was considered valuable enough to have, I mean, look, a paragraph, 4 verses describing the location. That's weird that would be in there if it didn't have some deeper meaning than just geography.
Right. Yeah. To dedicate the verses to this, there must be something to it. So the first thing I want to note, all right, is the idea that I think it may be a little bit presumptuous of us to assume that the location of the Pishon River was even ever known, right? Even if we go so far as to assume the Gihon is the Nile, the Pishon is the one where there's really no consensus at all. And I think that just the assumption that it's like, well, the ancient Israelite must have known what that meant, and we don't. Maybe they didn't either, right? Maybe they didn't know. Because if we look at the other 3, those are all very much known to man, right? But then perhaps the inclusion of this detail about the gold and onyx and bdellium it's meant to inform readers of kind of the grandeur of this river that they actually never knew, right? It would be a way of saying, here's what you don't know about this river. It went into this incredible land, so it must have been a great river like these other rivers that you're more familiar with, right? And the value of the other three would be well understood. Everyone knows the value of the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile. That value is very well understood, even if it's just referencing the spring in Jerusalem. Obviously, they know the value of that. If you've never heard of the Pishon, but it tells you, look at the value of this river because it is involved in the land of wealth here, of Havilah. Yeah. Then that is a way of describing that river as being on par with the others.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize what you're saying here, because if we look at verses 11 and 12 really are the ones that describe the Pishon, and then which describes more extensively. But then verse 13 gets into the Gihon, and it only says the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush.
Right.
Then it gets into the Tigris, and it just says it flows east of Assyria. And then the fourth, the Euphrates, it just says the Euphrates.
Right.
There's no descriptors of the nature of the river for the other three. And two of them, they just give location related to some place that the writer seems to assume that the reader would know where that is. But the Pishon, you're right, does get two full verses of descriptors. Of how it, both the geography and then also of what the river is like, or the land around the river is like. That's interesting. So that may assume that potentially the writer is saying, you don't know this river, let me describe it to you.
Yeah, this is unfamiliar to you, so
that's interesting.
I will fill you in on what it is, right?
Yeah.
So if we are to take that as to be the case, which again is an argument, then we might look at this passage as a way of describing, it's foreshadowing the future here, obviously, but as a way of describing just how lost Eden is to us, right? Because if you know all four rivers and you kind of imagine a source of it, it makes you feel like, well, maybe it's still attainable, right? Maybe you can find Eden somehow, right? If you can hunt down where these rivers used to all meet at some sort of common source or whatever.
Yeah.
But the idea, I think, here is no, the location, it's meant to be mysterious, and thus express to us how Eden is something hopefully lost to us.
Interesting.
So it builds out that idea, right?
Yeah.
And then there is a little bit more I think you can take from the passage as well regarding Eden's relationship to the rest of the world, right? Because it is interesting that it flows into Eden. A single river flows into Eden as a source, and then it flows into the garden from Eden, and then is split up within the garden. So if we might look at, again, what these rivers are. First, let's look at the Pishon, since that gives us all the description we're supposed to take from it. We know that the Pishon flows into a land of wealth, right? So the Pishon is associated with wealth. If we look at the Gihon, which is maybe the Nile, and let's say, okay, it's the Nile. With the land of Cush, there's a very, I think, strong argument for that. That river, I mean, it's hard to understate the value of that river. That river is so valuable that it allowed for one of the wealthiest, most advanced civilizations to emerge in what is otherwise a desert, right? It's all because of that river.
Yeah.
And then in a similar kind of vein, it's maybe not the sort of material wealth that we might think of, but in terms of just what is necessary to survive, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that's known as the Fertile Crescent for a reason. That's because the impact of those two rivers left a land that was rich for life to live within, basically everything that they needed.
Yeah.
So if we look at that, and we look at then these rivers coming from a single source from Eden proper and then dividing in the garden, we can sort of see that they're the source of life and wealth in the ancient world, right? That's what this is sort of describing. And rivers, we know, carry things from one place to another. So the idea here being that these rivers bring life, wealth, beauty out of Eden, and that process actually occurs through the tending of the garden. out into the world, right? And so this puts together Eden as the source of all life and wealth and beauty and these things. And then what happens in the garden is a way of almost distributing that, right, in a way, or and fostering it, all of that.
I want to emphasize, because we've mentioned this in past episodes, but for somebody who's jumping in right now, and even for myself as I'm listening to this, I'm having to consciously remember the garden is east of Eden.
Yes.
Eden proper is
in the east of Eden. So the garden is in the eastern part of Eden.
Part of Eden.
Yeah.
Eden
like
proper,
on the border.
The river flows out of Eden proper, which is an area.
Yeah.
And then the garden exists in the eastern portion of Eden. So when it says a river flowed out of Eden, which is a land area, into the garden.
Yeah, and they're divided
within the garden. That's the point to emphasize.
Yeah.
Because you're mentioning that there's something that distinctly comes out of Eden that then is processed, let's say, by the cultivation of the garden,
right?
That then the river then splits and cultivates the rest of the world.
Right. So there's something about
that's the symbol.
And we'll get to further actually in the next few episodes, the idea of being in the garden and the idea of bringing about order and God's order within the garden and all of that. And then we could take that to suggest that there's something about the process of ordering things according to God's order that distributes the life and beauty and wealth of the world, right? It puts it out there in a way that is accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So that's sort of what I think we can take from this. So if we put all of these ideas together, along with what we know about regarding the expulsion from the garden and the loss of access to Eden, we can look at all of this together and see that this passage sort of is reinforcing the idea that humanity, as a result of sin, is separated from that access to the source of life, wealth, and beauty, right? Sin hurts all of those things because we're pushed further away from that source. And in fact, we're even the place where it's divided, the garden, is now no longer accessible to us in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's a powerful statement about that source too.
Yes.
To say that there's one common source for these powerful rivers that have provided sustenance to human society.
Right.
To all the human society that was known at that time, at least to the readers of this. They're not, there's obviously other rivers in India and China that had similar functions, but those wouldn't be relatable to the reader.
Right.
So this is in essence saying that all of the
and in a way, by the way, you may look at the Gihon as representing those sort of symbolically.
Oh, that's a possibility too.
Unrelated ones too.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be a way of saying those things that are out there still sort of undiscovered. You might wrap them all into the Gihon if you wanted.
Exactly.
If you're thinking symbolically. So
yeah. And I think it's important. I'm sorry, one last thing to think in the I think to think in the mind of somebody who might be reading this as an ancient. I think it's appropriate to read it as both symbolic and geographic. And people who really want to be literalists in reading the Bible might have a major issue with this, but that's all right. If you're reading something as an ancient, it's not like they're going to go fact check this and they're going to trace the paths of the Euphrates and the Tigris and say, wait a second, they never intersect.
Right.
And so in many ways they might hear it and believe that the Tigris and the Euphrates and then the Gihon and the Gihon all have a common source.
Sure.
And it's geographic in that sense to the ancient, but it also probably carries with it this symbolic meaning that we're emphasizing.
I was going to say it's geographic.
It's not only it's geographic in
way.
that it's geographic in that also would, or it's symbolic in that geography would symbolize something to an ancient.
Yes, yeah.
And still does to us as well in some ways. Like we use representations of mountains and mountaintop experiences to describe them as spiritual experiences because it seems where the sky and the earth touch. Right. Or we use other things to emphasize that now. And that would be the same idea, is that look, geographically this happens, therefore there must be some sort of symbolic source to this too. So it's not a clear, especially probably in an ancient's mind, it's not a clear symbolic or geographic interpretation. They probably view it as both.
Yeah, they're not
and
distinct.
That may mean that there's geographic inaccuracies here, but that's not an issue, I think.
What I was going to say is that the geographic matters in the sense that it serves the symbolic meaning.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And to the extent that we can understand the symbolic meaning, that's what really matters. So if the geography doesn't exactly line up, that's not really important. The point is, what is the symbolically expressed here, the spiritual truth that is encapsulated, right?
Which is why we spend more time on that.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I guess it would be to say that somebody might read this as an ancient and say, wow, that's a really interesting geographic fact. They won't question it. And then they will say, but what does that mean? They might think, well, look at the way the world is set up. All good things come from a single source.
Yes.
And so that's a powerful interpretation of geography. And that might be how they would interpret it.
Yes.
Whether it's geographic or fact, now that we look back on it, is irrelevant, like you said.
Right. And I should say too, the idea is we've lost access to the source, right? We haven't lost access to those things that eventually flow out. It's just we don't have the connection to the source. And interestingly, we no longer have connection to the garden, which is this point where it's sort of distributed from. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I mean, you might look at that and say, oh, that sort of represents the fact that living in this world of sin, right, where things are broken, there's a sense in which equality or equity or something like that is always going to be distorted, right? Things aren't going to ever be perfectly even or equal, or opportunities be the same, or all of that stuff. And why is that? Well, that's because we're gone from the garden, right? Yeah. So our ability to distribute things just out from the garden, the way these rivers did, that is lost to us. As a result of sin. And so we should expect a world where there are the poor and the wealthy, and and we don't all have the same opportunities by birth and those things. Mm-hmm. That's kind of to be expected in a way. Yeah. So all right, so with that, we're gonna, again, we've looked at those verses more verses than we've done quite a bit. And so we did do 5 verses in one episode, which is way above of our normal pace. So in order to balance things out, we're going to take the next 3 episodes on just the next verse. So I'm going to make an argument. It's hard to say what is the most important verse in the Bible. Mm-hmm. That's a tough thing to argue or claim.
Like a favorite child.
Yeah, I'm going to say this is one that is at the top of the pyramid. You know, it's I don't know if it is the very tippy top, but it's up near the top of important verses in the Bible. And I don't think most people would put it that way, but I think we'll see why over the course of the next 3 episodes. So all right, with that, be sure to subscribe wherever you are, so that way, you know, you're sure to get all 3 of those episodes, like or comment or whatever it is on your I think they call it rumbling on Rumble. I think you rumble the video. You know, so do all of those things.
Just don't grumble.
Yeah, don't grumble. Exactly. Or if you'd like to grumble, go ahead, shoot us an email. We're unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll take all grumblings there. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks.